the Book of the Dead it's a funerary text, but it's a collective term. It's not something the Egyptians themselves would have used. The scene, which is the Hall of Judgment, where we have the weighing of the heart, is actually the book of coming forth by day, and the book of emerging into light, sort of thing. Those are probably two of the most prevalent passages in, if you look at the Papyrus of Ani, I think it's 140 meters long. So, I mean, there was a lot of spells and incantations in there. He wasn't taking any shortcuts, put it that way. So, when the mummy has been completed, these are some of the other pectorals that one would see. This is obviously the falcon Horus himself, and he holds two of the Shen in his talons, topped with the symbol of life, the Ankh. This is the goddess Nekhbet, which is the vulture goddess, and this is the one, as I mentioned before, this great collar on the left-hand side was placed shoulder to shoulder on the mummy of Tutankhamun, and she was literally responsible for restoring the breath to the mummy. And so this is just another close-up image of another pectoral that also existed among his treasures. And these are Kepher, the beetle, which stands for the eternity and eternal life, and you see beautiful jeweled representations of that. One of them, of course, is actually supporting the sun disk, which is representative of the god Ra. And this is the Wadjet Eye, again surmounted by Nekhbet on one side and the Uraeus or Buto on the other side. And they represent, in this case, Upper and Lower Egypt as well. Buto was from Lower Egypt, and Nekhbet represented Upper Egypt. And here are, again, representations of the spells and incantations used during the wrapping process. And this is the wrapping of the mummy with the, quote, Book of the Dead. The arms and the legs are tied together. Now, there's some distinction on how arms and legs are placed in mummies. Collectively speaking, most male mummies, not of rank, sort of thing, would have their arms near their sides. Most female mummies would have their arms crossed over their pelvis. And then when we get into royal mummies, we have the arms of the pharaoh crossed doubly, and the arms of a queen, the left-hand arm crossing her heart, sort of thing. It's not universal, but it's basically accepted that these were the forms. At this point, when we have the amulets in place and the things, the arms and the legs are now tied together, oftentimes a Book of the Dead, or in this case, would be placed between the hands or somewhere in the center of the body before this mummy becomes shrouded. There is a wonderful statue vignette of Osiris upstairs in the what I call the afterlife area, and it is the description says that the back of it contained a hollow chamber at the back of it, which was actually thought to contain a Book of the Dead. So even this practice is not universal, but we do have evidence in some other mummies of this practice being used, so I've used it as an example here. Then we get to the shrouding. These are the final strips that go over the mummy, and then we get the first of what could be several shrouds. In this case, that actually painted an image of Osiris onto the shroud. There is evidence of paintings or hieroglyphics being painted onto the overlaying shroud, but many of these things, when they've opened, they're either missing or they've disintegrated to the point that they can't really say with certainty exactly what was there, but they know that a shroud was contained, primarily because of Tutankhamun's mummies. When his final coffin was opened, it still bore a funeral wreath of dried flowers around it, about his neck and stuff like that. So there was much more evidence of how close the Egyptians paid to these final rituals. So this is the final wrapping, where they literally tie everything together, wrapping the shroud, making sure everything is a tight bundle. And oftentimes when you see mummies, this is what you will see of an open mummy, are these very tight wrappings like this. And some of them, they look like they've been braided by a master braider. They're just absolutely breathtaking. So then we actually have Anubis here conducting the newly created mummy to the Hall of Judgment for his funeral rites. This is showing the family in mourning for them, and it's believed that mourning wasn't so much as a tear festival as it was a celebration, because the deceased was going to an eternal life, which was no different from what he enjoyed in the living world. Everything was there, and the family would continue to bring offerings of food and wine and things like that. Even if it was symbolic, they would still be doing this in that memory. And so it really was, it was more like a passage of space and time than it was a physical change as we recognize death today. So then we have the opening of the mouth ceremony. This is where the mummy's breathing has been restored and essentially now capable of traversing the spirit world to the real world. And this was a very important aspect of the funeral services. And then, of course, this is the all-encompassing rite. This is the Hall of Judgment, and this is what allows you to proceed to the afterlife. Here you have Anubis weighing the heart on the left against the feather of Mot, the goddess Mot, with Thoth recording the rituals and what's happening here, and of course, whether or not this balance happens. And just behind Thoth here, if this had been enlarged, Amit would be sitting there just chomping at the bit. So that is my presentation. If there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them. Yes?
I didn't hear you mention anything about the blood.
The blood, as I mentioned, all of the rags and linens and materials that they used during the cleansing and drying process, that those would have sopped up any of the blood from the body cavities. They were not discarded. They were either placed in a chest or some other container, and they were interred in the tomb. Yeah. Yes?
What about the kidneys and the other organs that weren't?
This question came up earlier.
Oh, okay.
The simple answer to this is that the Egyptians basically didn't see the kidneys. The kidneys are an organ which are known as retroperitoneal. In other words, they lay below the peritoneal lining at the back, sort of thing. So when you eviscerate the abdominal organs like the intestines and the large bowel and stuff like that, you may cut through the ureters and things like that, but you're not going to see the kidneys because you literally have to, go through the musculature to get them. I'm sorry, was the question here?
If you're removing the lungs
Yes.
from an incision in the left abdominal cavity, it seems to me, and leaving the heart, you're going to have a knife to go through the diaphragm.
Exactly. This is where they would use their obsidian or copper blades to do this. I find myself, I mean, just because I don't have the expertise to say exactly how the Egyptians did this, but as someone that has eviscerated many a cadaver sort of thing, my tendency was to do a much more open incision than a 6 to 7 inch incision in the abdominal wall and take things out in blocks, you know, sort of thing. So if I do a thoracic block, you know, I'm going to grab things from the trachea to the diaphragm, and everything is going to come out, pericardium, everything. That, in which case I would then remove the heart and put it back in the cadaver. How they could conceivably remove an individual organ working through this narrow little opening in the left abdomen, I can't conceive it myself, you know, sort of thing. If they did, they had, you know, the surgeons of, they had some very skilled surgeons then. You know, does that help?
Is evidence that they used a knife inside?
Well, they would have had to use their blades or implements of some kind, because there is evidence of the tearing of the diaphragm, for example. And we can see that in some of the CAT scans that have been done of tissue that remains. It's really quite jagged. Yes?
Another question, the
Sure.
carpet jars. I seem to recall reading that they came in a variety of sizes.
Yeah, they
So how
did, you
some
know.
of the organs fit if you had a small jar?
Well, don't forget, like when any body organ is dried out, you know, it is about 70% liquid, water. So you're really going to have a small shriveled mass
Even
when
the
it's
lungs
done.
in the jar?
Yeah, believe it or not,
Okay.
the lungs really are the most aqueous of all the organs in the body, sort of thing. They are essentially small air spaces that are, you know, but the lungs themselves are filled with fluid and blood and stuff like that, and it's that transference of oxygenated blood that allows us to actually, the alveoli, to absorb the oxygen through, it's almost an osmotic type of thing. I could get into this, but I mean, it would take forever and a day to explain it.
There's the mummified cat.
Yes.
Up there. There's a lot of interest when I'm
Mm-hmm.
going through. And they say, it's so small. I mean, how come it's like this size? I mean, was it baby cats that they did, or how did they do that?
That could have been, you know, I mean, we don't know, for example, how large an adult cat in Egypt was, but I would imagine that they had enough rodents to feed on that they were of, you know, average size. But again, it could have been a young one for all we know, but I mean, when you dry anything out, it's really going to lose a substantial part of its body mass.
I guess they would think like the head was even very, you know, like it was
Mhm.
tiny like this, and, you know, there was no looking of arms or anything, it was just kind of straight. So would they kind of just like get the bones and get everything so that they would?
They probably aligned the body, you know, as compact as they could. And don't forget too that if you look at the step pyramid at Saqqara and many of the enclosures that are there were whole chambers that were basically treasuries of mummified remains of numerous animals, hawks, whatever. Yeah, exactly. But many of them are fake. You know, they were bundles of straw that were wrapped up in linen and sold to unsuspecting, you know, believers.
So charlatans,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
You know, there. You know, like P.T. Barnum said, there's a sucker born every minute. Anyway, are there? Yes, sir.
Just would like to add a comment that you mentioned that Tutankhamun mummy had too many amulets that are used to close sutures.
No, I didn't say he had too many amulets. It's just the abundance of them was.
Yeah, that's because it is believed that he was killed in either in a it's a chariot accident, either in a battle or in a hunting accident. So the mummy was scarred already when he was dead, and those were foreclosing these scars.
Indeed, that it's entirely possible. There are many speculations on what the cause of Tutankhamun's death was. There were so many, since 2009, there have been at least 4 major DNA studies that have been done, especially since they've identified the remains of whom they call the younger woman, because we lack a name, but she has been identified as the mother of Tutankhamun, who was either a secondary wife or a concubine of Akhenaten. And but there are many genetic disorders which could have also led to his death. He was known to be afflicted with malaria. There was no treatment for malaria then, so malaria in itself could have been a malignant disease at that point. He did have evidence of a broken leg, so septicemia was also a large component there. And as I said, battle or chariot accident or hunting accident, I would surmise hunting accident than I would battle, because there's no documentary evidence that Tutankhamun ever had need or occasion to go into battle of any kind. His country was relatively stable politically at that time. So as I said, you will have one scholar saying one thing and another saying something else. So it's, you know, kind of still undetermined. Yes?
You mentioned a mummy cache.
Mm-hmm.
Call something.
Yeah, near the Valley of the Kings, or may have even been in the Valley of the Kings. My memory is not sustaining me properly here. There was a tomb that the priests of that were sort as I said, the priests of Amun had many different functions, not just embalmers. They were in charge of the, say, for the Valley of the Kings. Some of them were in charge of specific temples. You know, there was a whole political structure there, which was ginormous. It was literally a political machine. But because they had seen that many of these tombs were being raided by robbers, or, you know, and this was being done in antiquity primarily. I think in some occasions there were probably some pharaohs that went in and used previous pharaoh's tomb as a treasury. Like, I need money for this next little battle that I'm going to do, so we'll go and take some of the wealth out of this tomb. You know, some scholars have put forth that theory as well, sort of thing. It was essentially portable wealth that was like banked in the Valley of the Tombs. But anyway, because these tombs were being successfully raided, where they couldn't keep the police force that they had in the Valley of Tombs constantly vigilant, the priests decided to collect all of the royal mummies and preserve them in one designated secret location. And it has a name and it has a number, and both of which are right out the window at the moment, sort of thing. But a cache of, I think, 33 royal mummies were found in this particular gravesite.
And as I recall from my visit there, they didn't name them, so they don't know who is who.
No, many of them were identifiable, because I mean, one of the mummies was of that of Ramses II upstairs and Seti I, and but it seems really odd, because Ramesses, here's this great pharaoh that ruled Egypt for 67 years, and he's basically interred in a very plain wooden anthropomorphic formed coffin, you know, but it was just essentially carved wood with just a simple hieroglyphic name inscribed down the center of it. One would have expected a very elaborate, you know, coffin for someone of his standing and position. And but no, many of the pharaohs, because even the mummy wrappings, as I've mentioned before, the name being so important, the name would have often been inscribed on some of these linen wrappings, you know, sort of thing. And this is how we're able to identify them. In the case of this mummy that's recently been identified as the younger woman who we now know to be Tutankhamun's mother, there are no references to her names in her wrappings. So therefore, you know, all we can say is we have a CAT scan that basically tells us this is the age range that she was at the time of her death, you know, sort of thing. And all we can do is call her the younger woman. Any other questions? Yes?
Was there any role for women identified in the whole funereal and mummification process?
Well, you know, in the case of living members of the family, the wife would have played a very integral role in funeral services, you know, sort of thing. And she probably, by and large, inherited a great deal of her deceased husband's property as well, because Egyptian women had the right to own and possess property in their own right. Like when they married, their property didn't necessarily become the property of their husbands unless they gifted it to them.
But
Yes.
I mean, not from the point of inheritance or ritual, but in the technical mummification process, in the,
No, she wouldn't have. She wouldn't have taken a specific role there. That was the domain of the specialized priests, and to my knowledge, there were no female priests in the temples of Amun. Whereas when we get into Greco-Roman culture, there were often priestesses serving the gods. But in Egyptology, I don't recall any references to females serving in the temples. Yes?
I'm just curious, did mummification happen anywhere else outside Egypt?
Oh, yes. Peru, Mexico, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Tolmecs, the Olmecs, they all practices forms of mummification. Yes. Any other questions?
I'm just curious, did the Chinese practice mummification? I know that mummies were found.
Yes, mummies are found in China, but not to the, you couldn't make a direct comparison to Egyptian mummies and Chinese mummies. The mummies that were essentially created in China were the result of being encased in jade suits and then and placed into very dry desert-like tombs, especially the Ming tombs. They border the areas of the Mongolian desert sort of thing, so it's very dry there, so the mummies would have been kind of naturally created.
They said, I read a book called the Mummy Congress.
Mm-hmm.
It took place down in South America somewhere.
Yeah, just recently, actually. Yeah, okay. Well, there was a one just recently, because one of the staff members here at the museum was just there. It was held in Tenerife. I thought, geez, how nice, you know, sort of thing. But
In that book, it was the mummies in China. They suspected they were Vikings because they were tall, 6-foot redhead mummies.
well, I haven't read that myself, so I wouldn't want to hazard a guess on something that I haven't become acquainted with. But there is some speculation that the Chinese traveled the globe much more extensively than was heretofore thought. You know, yes.
This is a stupid question, but what, you know, we took
No
out
question is
dyes.
ever stupid.
They took out dyes.
Yes.
Then they made wood dyes. Did they paint them?
Yes, they did.
Oh, they
Yes,
did?
they did. They put painted eyes in, or glass eyes or something. And they didn't necessarily, I mean, unless they were removing the eyes to take out the brain, the eyes would have just naturally desiccated, you know, through the drying process.